Chapter 7. Sit. Mandy looked up from the book she was reading. It was called You and Your Dog. She looked across the hunter's kitchen table at James. James also had his nose buried deep in a book. Blackie was curled up fast asleep in his basket. You know, James, she said, it's time to start thinking about Blackie's obedience training. After all, he's 12 weeks old now. James looked up from the book. I know, he said, but how can we train him with Benji around? Blackie still runs away every time he sees Benji. We could take him to Animal Ark, Mandy said. James shook his head. Blackie hasn't had all his shots yet, he said. We can't let him come in contact with other animals in case he picks up an infection. There are too many animals coming in and out of the clinic. We need somewhere quiet, with no other animals. And somewhere that Blackie can't get out of, said Mandy. He's good at getting out of places, James said. He nearly got out of the garden yesterday. The back door opened, and Mrs. Hunter came in just in time to hear James's last words. I tore a new pair of tights scrambling in the hedge to catch him, she said. Blackie stirred and sat up, blinking at the sound of James's mother's voice. Now, don't you go getting into any more mischief, Mrs. Hunter scolded him. The front doorbell rang. Mrs. Hunter put her shopping basket down on the floor and went out to answer the door. Mandy was still thinking about Blackie's training. We could take him to Grandma's and Grandpa's, she said. Grandpa has just put a new fence all around their garden. Even Blackie couldn't get out of it. James pushed his book aside, looking hopeful. Blackie scrambled out of his basket and scampered across the floor. That's a great idea, James said. Then he looked at Blackie. Oh, no, he said. Blackie, no! The little dog was tugging at a paper bag in Mrs. Hunter's shopping basket. The bag burst open, and several cream pastries rolled across the floor. Blackie pounced on one of them and began licking up the cream. The kitchen door opened before Mandy or James could get to Blackie. What on earth? Began Mrs. Hunter as she came back in. Then she looked at James. It's about time that puppy started learning how to behave himself, she said. James looked at Mandy. Are you sure your grandma and grandpa would let us train Blackie at their house? Mandy smiled. Of course they would, she said. They'd love it. Just you wait and see. Sit, James said sternly. It was Saturday, and Mandy and James were in the back garden of Lilac Cottage, Mandy's grandparents' house. Blackie looked up at James and wagged his tail. Maybe if you pushed his bottom down at the same time you said sit, suggested Mandy. James looked at her in despair. I've tried that, he said. Mandy bit her lip. They'd been trying to train Blackie for 2 weeks now, and were getting nowhere. The little puppy looked eagerly at them, jumping up and resting his paws against James's jeans. Mandy moved a few yards away and looked at Blackie. Stay, she said in a firm voice. Blackie immediately ran toward her. It's hopeless, said Mandy, laughing. I don't think we'll ever train him. Licorice always sits when I tell him to, said a voice behind them. Sarah, said Mandy, turning around. Sarah was standing at the back garden gate with Licorice in her arms. Does he really sit when you tell him to? Asked James, coming over. Let's see. I don't know how you can get him to do it as he's told. Sarah drew back, cradling Licorice in her arms. I can't, she said. Not here. He's still got one more bunch of shots to take, and I'm not allowed to put him down outside until he's had all of them. Mandy nodded. Blackie gets his final bunch next week, she said. We had to carry him all the way here, but he can run around in the garden. It's safe here. Sarah put her nose in the air. Run around is right, she said. Where is he gone? Mandy and James looked around. Blackie, James called. Blackie, where are you? Huh, said Sarah. He doesn't even answer to his name. Just you wait and see what Licorice can do at a pet day. And she walked off down the street. Mandy and James looked at each other. Where is he? Said Mandy. Grandpa came around the side of the garden shed. Oh, Grandpa, have you seen Blackie? Asked Mandy. I certainly have. He was in my raspberry bushes, Grandpa told him. Mandy looked up at him. Oh, no, she said. Grandpa's eyes twinkled. It's all right, he said. I caught him before he did any harm." "But where is he now?" said James. Grandpa rubbed his nose. "Mandy's grandma has him in the house," he said. "She really likes the little one." Mandy smiled. "I knew it was a good idea to bring him to Lilac Cottage," she said. "So, how is the training going?" Grandpa asked. Mandy and James looked at each other. "It isn't very easy," James said. "Blackie looks at us with those big brown eyes of his," Mandy said. "And you can't bear to scold him?" Grandpa said. Mandy nodded. "He's such a sweetie," she said. Grandpa grunted. "If he gets in among my raspberry bushes again, he won't be a sweetie to me," he said. Mandy bit her lip. She knew Grandpa didn't mean it. He was just as fond of Blackie as Grandma was, but she and James didn't seem to be making much progress with Blackie's training. Maybe they weren't being firm enough with him. The back door opened and Grandma popped her head out. "Come and see this," she said. "You won't believe it." Mandy and James rushed to the door with Grandpa following. Blackie was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor. "What is it?" said James. Then Mandy realized Blackie wasn't running around or trying to chew anybody's shoelaces. He was just sitting there. "I told him to sit," Grandma said proudly. "And he did?" said James. "Mrs. Hope, you're amazing." Grandma shook her head and smiled. "It's all done by kindness," she said. Mandy looked at Blackie. "Good boy," she said. "Wait until Sarah sees this at Pet Day." Blackie gave a short bark and scampered off out of the back door. "My raspberry bushes!" Grandpa shouted. The four of them raced after Blackie until Mandy, flushed bright red, caught him and gathered him up into her arms. "What that little one needs is a leash and collar," Grandpa said. Mandy looked at her grandpa. "But he's so young," she said. Grandpa was firm. 14 weeks isn't too young for a leash and collar, he said. "You're going to be able to take him out for walks soon. You'll need to have him on a leash then." "That's right," said James. "Mrs. McFarlane at the general store had some nice dog collars last week," said Grandma. Mandy smiled at her. "Then that's where we'll go," she said. "We'll do that this afternoon." The general store was Mandy's favorite shop in the village. You could get almost anything there, comics and candy, books and puzzles. The shelves were piled high with all kinds of things. Mandy pushed open the door and she and James went inside. "Well," said Mrs. McFarlane, "what can I do for you?" Then she saw Blackie in James's arms. My," she said. "What a beautiful puppy." James beamed with pride as Mrs. McFarlane came around from behind the counter to admire Blackie. "We want a leash and collar for him," said Mandy. Mrs. McFarlane smiled. "And I have just the thing," she said. "I've got a beautiful red leather one that would suit him well, and I can make him a tag with your address and phone number on it, James." She took a collar and leash down from a hook and handed them to James. "They're great," said Mandy. James looked at the collar doubtfully. "It won't hurt him, will it?" he said. Mrs. McFarlane shook her head. "Not a bit," she replied. "It would hurt him a lot more if he got away from you and ran into the road and got hit by a car." "That's true," said Mandy. James made up his mind. "We'll take him," he said. Mandy helped him fasten the collar around Blackie's neck and clip on the leash. It wasn't easy. Blackie wiggled and squirmed and scratched at the collar with his paws. "He doesn't like it," said James. Mandy looked down at the little puppy. He was looking up at her, and his big brown eyes looked sad. "But he has to wear it," she said. James looked at his pet. "I suppose so," he said. Mrs. McFarlane smiled at them. "He'll get used to it soon," she said. "Just make sure you keep it on him when you're walking him. He's far too young to be off the leash yet, if he isn't somewhere safe." Mandy nodded, but James was still looking worried. "Come on, James," she said. "Let's take him home and try walking him on the leash to see if he gets used to it." But when they got back to James's house and set Blackie down in the garden, he didn't seem to like the collar at all. He kept scratching and tugging at it until James picked him up and gave him a hug. "He really does have to get used to it," Mandy said gently. "It will take some time." James looked at her. She could see he was upset. "Maybe the collar is too tight," he said. "Maybe if I loosened it a bit, he wouldn't mind so much." "Maybe," said Mandy, "but don't loosen it so much that he can slip out of it." James nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Mandy knew it was very hard to train a puppy. Sometimes it seemed very cruel, but she was sure James would be used to training Blackie and that Blackie would get used to being trained.